Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's EBC video. We're here on the Bloomington Ferry Bridge thinking about Matthew 14. It's verses 13 through 21, and it's one of the most famous miracles in the Bible. We learn it from our youngest years. It's Jesus feeding the 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Now, when this story opens, Jesus is actually sad. He's just learned that John the Baptist has been killed in prison, and he's trying to withdraw to a deserted place in the wilderness. But the crowds follow him. And when Jesus sees these crowds, he has compassion on them, and he starts healing the crowds. Now, I just want to pause for a moment there. We could learn everything we needed to know this week just based on what we've heard so far. Jesus is in that moment where he's sad, and he's just learned that his friend John the Baptist has died. And now suddenly Jesus is confronted with all these people who still need help. And what Jesus winds up doing is saying, I still have time for you. I can still do great deeds for you, even in those moments where I'm in need as well. And it just tells us one of those things that we can do in our lives is find comfort, even in our times of sadness, by doing great things for others and finding those ways to serve, even in those moments for us. But that's not all the story, right? So Jesus is preaching and he's healing, and then there comes a moment when it's getting late in the day and the disciples say, Jesus, send these people away. It actually specifies in Matthew that the disciples say, send them back into town to buy their own food. And Jesus doesn't say, I'll take care of it at that point. Jesus says, you feed them. He says, you feed them to the disciples. This is just a great moment, right? Like the disciples are like, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, right? But I think there's a real reason we're going to see in a moment why Jesus was saying to the disciples, you feed all of these people. So of course Jesus takes all the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes that he has, and he blesses them and he gives thanks for them, and then he starts breaking the bread and handing it out to the disciples, and everyone is fed. There's enough food for all 5,000 people, and there's even 12 baskets left over. It's this wonderful moment of empirical proof in the Bible where it says that there's all these baskets of food left over. So we're really clear here that it's not a moment where we had 5 loaves and 2 fishes and then everyone was saying, hey, let's just take a little bit and then we'll be fine. No, this is actually that moment where Jesus is demonstrating that he's already had enough food to feed everyone and all this food left over. Now, when Jesus is done with all of that, we learn that all of the people have been fed and all that food is left over. What happens next is this. We look at this story and we think about what it means. And of course, there's just this miracle right here, and that's awesome all by itself. But actually this week, I was reading something by Professor Shazer out of in St. Paul, and he's telling us about a really interesting aspect of this story, and it's why we're standing on a bridge tonight. The reason we're standing on a bridge is because there are elements of this story that echo Exodus, and then elements of this story that foreshadow the Last Supper and even Pentecost. And I just love these elements. Jesus is a bridge between those Old Testament Israelites and then Christians who will come after Jesus and believe in him as Jesus, as the Savior. And what happens is, as Jesus is going out to the wilderness and all the people are following him, that's an echo of the fact that the Israelites went out into the wilderness. And then there's these little textual points in the Bible where the people followed on foot. The same way that it uses the phrases that they followed on foot into the wilderness in Exodus. And then we also have these throngs of people, 5,000 of these other textual points where it's the men plus the women and the children, and that exists too when we're talking about this miracle. But then in addition to all of that, we have just the obvious miracle itself, which is Jesus is feeding everyone out in the wilderness, just like God had provided the manna for the Israelites out in the wilderness. So we've got these great linkages. And then at the same time, we've got in Matthew this really specific moment of Jesus breaking the bread and handing out to the disciples. So we hear that foreshadowing of the Last Supper. And then actually the fact that he gives it to the disciples, right? He had said to the disciples, you feed them. And it's that moment that sort of feels like Pentecost then, where it's not just Jesus saying, hey, I'll take care of it, don't worry about it, everyone's going to believe in me. No, Jesus is empowering the disciples to do the miracle by feeding everyone and do that. So I think these are just great pieces of the story that help remind us that even when God is there creating miracles, he's telling us that he's ready to help us be a part of that miracle. Help us to actually do those great things. And so I think there's two messages I want to leave you with this week. One is that it's so easy for us to be thinking about Jesus as sort of taking those sort of old Israelite and Jewish traditions and sort of moving on from them. And I don't think that's always true, right? What's really happening is Jesus is connecting that history of God and the followers of Jesus, of God and Jesus, and bringing those into the present, even into our lives. And then in addition to all of that, it's just reminding us that when God is there to do miracles, we're there to help and participate and be a part of those miracles. So this week, everyone, have a great and fantastic week, and find a moment where God's about to do a miracle and be the hands for that miracle. Thanks, everybody.